You can use the API Inspector tool as a starter set when you want to develop your own applications. For example, let's build an application that will automatically retrieve a summary of all your unread messages immediately after login and present them in a scrolling field. I'm going to start by duplicating the API Inspector folder in its entirety and rename it Unread Mail. I'll also rename each of the inspector files to Unread Mail instead of Inspector. Now I can open this folder in my code editor of choice, Sublime Text. I must now modify the index.html file to reference our newly named CSS and JSS files. I check unread.js to make sure that my server address and port is the FirstClass Web Services instance that I want to connect to, and test to make sure that I have a successful connection. I do, so we can proceed. Using the API DocSet viewer, I want to know what the query parameters would be to retrieve unread mail, so I choose Typed Folders, Mailbox Unread, and then copy and paste that query into my query field and submit it. Rather than displaying the return JSON, I'll want to display a summary that includes the user's profile icon, the subject, the from name, and the date for each of the unread messages. We'll look at that in a minute, but first let's clean up and remove some of the things that we do not need. Let's log off and return to our index.html file. I'm going to change this title to Unread Mail. Eventually I'll remove the API DocSet iframe, but I'm going to leave it for now. I don't need a link to the full documentation, so this gets removed. I need the login entry fields, but I don't need to display the server and port, so I'll delete these divs. Similarly, since this is a single function application, I'll not be asking the user to enter a query string. I will be going to do that in code, so I'm going to remove the getPostData div. Let's see if it still works. Good, it does. Now we can start to modify the unreadmail.js file. The first thing I'm going to do is remove my global.fcdata variable. It doesn't have to be global, as we'll deal with the data within the callback function. I now remove the two instances where we assign the return data to this now deleted variable. And finally, I rename all references of the fcdata variable to the local data variable using Sublime Text multi-edit functionality. In the jQuery AJAX function for login logoff, I'll remove the references to the show and hide getPostData since we've deleted that div. Let's test one more time to see if it works. Great, we're on a roll. Now, instead of displaying the login reply content, I want to jump directly to get our unread message content, so I'll remove this line to display the results, and instead call a function that we will use to retrieve our unread mail. Let's call it display unread mail, and we'll call it right after we hide our login entry field. The function is going to submit the query URL just as if we had clicked on our Submit Data button in the API Inspector, only now there's no button to submit. So we'll copy the function from the click event of this button and delete the event. I'll also delete this change event for the query field. Let's create our new function now and paste that content into it. The getURL variable needs the query for retrieving unread mail, so I'll return to my DevDocs tool and copy it and replace the field value entry with this query and enclose it with quotes so that it gets concatenated with our server address. I know that this is a GET request, so I can remove all references to the vKeys object, as this is not required for a GET request. Testing our login once more, we see that we are now getting the JSON for our mailbox displayed. I no longer need the docset tool, so I can remove that iframe from my index file. And in my CSS, I can extend the height of my results container to say 600 pixels. One more thing to clean up. Let's hide the container until we have a login where we'll show it, and then hide it again when I log off. So in the CSS for this container, let's add display none. Back in our unreadmail.js, we can add our jQuery results container show on a successful login and the corresponding hide when logging off. One more test to make sure it's working. It is, so now all we have to do is parse the JSON to display our summary list of unread messages instead of the raw JSON. After looking at the code sum, it doesn't take a lot of investigation to realize that the data.mlds item contains the array of messages. Each array contains a field 9, which is the subject, a field 8010, which is the from address, and the short info.mod date, which is the message date. I notice a difference between the first message from Emily Heydrich and this one that looks like it's from noreply@facebook.com. The first message is a local user, and the second one is from the internet. In both cases, field 8098 is the client ID for the user or the internet gateway. We can use this field to retrieve the user's profile picture. Here's what we get in the documentation for retrieving that image. The internet gateway doesn't have a profile, but the API is smart enough to provide a generic image instead. So let's make note of this, and we'll use that when we start to build our code. Let's do that now. We can change this line, which stringifies our data, as we will not be presenting it. So let's set our variable to an empty string. Now we can use jQuery's each function to step through all of the items in the data.mlds array. So we start with jQuery.each, data.mlds, function, and then we'll iterate over each of the items and grab the values, and then we'll loop through that with our code. So within this loop, we'll add HTML to our data received string. So let me paste that code into here, and we'll go through it. We use our code to retrieve our profile image from the server, just as we had seen in our documentation, and we'll use the CID field, which we can retrieve using the V, which is our value, 8098 field item. and then we'll create an image source tag so that we can present it on the screen. Next, we'll grab the from address, which is in field ID 8010, and if it's an internet address, we'll use the firstclass.util.unescape.html function to unescape any of these special characters. Next, we'll present the subject field, and then finally we'll grab the shortinfo.mod date and run it through our sa_time to JS local time function to make it readable. And lastly, we change our response body.html to just the data received. Testing our application once more, you see we have accomplished what we have set out to do. Of course, you can be more creative with the CSS and perhaps float the profile picture to the left so that the text wraps on the right, or bold the labels, but I'll leave that up to you. I hope this series has been able to give you some insights on the possibilities, and that you will be able to take what you have learned to build your own applications using the FirstClass API.